At 2 or 3 years old, my cousin was kidnapped. At the time, they lived in a big city outside of the United States. He was on a playground with his brother and babysitter when he was suddenly grabbed and thrown into a van that sped away. Someone from the neighborhood that was already in their car tried to follow them, but the van got away. My aunt and uncle ended up filing a police report and were pretty much told by them not to keep their hopes up. Weirdly, by the end of the evening that same day, my cousin was dropped back off at the playground. When they asked my cousin what happened, apparently all the kidnappers did was drive around the city all day with him, gave him a bunch of candy and toys, and dropped him back off. I hike in a lot of remote areas. I was hiking in Pennsylvania, miles from anything, not even on a trail, just bushwhacking through the woods. When I come up on this guy about 200 feet away sitting on a log, just sitting there in jeans and a hoodie over his head, staring at me. I wave. He doesn't wave back. I start walking over, wave again and yell something like, "Wow, wasn't expecting to see anyone else out here." No response. I was getting a little nervous, but I had already committed to keep approaching. Then I start noticing rock piles and circles and things like scraps of clothing hanging in the trees. I get about 10 feet from him, and this friggin' pheasant takes off, scaring the shit out of me. That's when I notice it's not a man, it's a mannequin, sitting there, dressed up, surrounded by strange rock piles and things hanging in the trees, miles from anything. I hightailed it out of there thinking maybe I had come upon something drug-related. I have no idea. I was looking at apartment buildings, but I saw a basement apartment with a rent that was ridiculously low for the area. There were pictures, the basement was finished, looked professionally decorated, and even had high ceilings. I contacted the person and was at the house checking out the place before the end of the day. It was a husband and wife who had converted their basement for a bit of extra income. They told me the rent was so low because they wanted someone to move in immediately. After the tour, things got odd. After telling the husband I loved the space, he pulled out a lease and started badgering me into signing it right then and there. When I'm reluctant, he started knocking hundreds of dollars off of the rent, to the point that this apartment, advertised for around $1,200 a month, was now being offered to me at $600 a month. He starts getting more and more frantic and excited, telling me if I don't have any furniture not to worry about it. He and his wife would supply me with everything I would need. All I would have to do was ask, just sign the paper. That's when I noticed that he was actually physically blocking the exit, and that his wife was staring at me like I was a hamburger. I hightailed it out of there. Still feel like I should have alerted the police or something, though I imagine if people started disappearing, it would have been in the news or something. Right? I used to pick up my prescriptions at a late-night pharmacy in a bad part of town, because they always renewed early, and I likes my drugs. One night, a large homeless man asked me for money as I was walking out. I mumbled something about not having cash and continued walking to my car. As I approach my car, I look in the reflection of my driver's side window and see that he's been following me and now is right behind me. He has this hard, angry look on his face, and I'm a little chick. I didn't want him forcing his way in my car, so I grip my keys and turn around to face him. Right as I did, an old hoopty pulls up right beside us, rolls down the back window, and a German shepherd sticks his head out and starts ferociously barking at the man. Creepy bum takes off running. The two men in the front seat of the car wordlessly nod to me and peel out into the night. My dad was a gravedigger as a teenager. Usually, they dug a grave in the daytime and were done well before dark. Well, my dad decided to go screw around with some of his friends and told the other guy he'd be back to finish his part. He didn't get back until sundown. So now he was stuck digging alone in the dark with a gas lamp. This was a long-ass time ago. He did have the company of the groundskeeper's little Jack Russell Terrier. So he's almost done working on the last bit by the foot of the grave, when the dog starts making these alternating growls and whines. He was so focused on finishing the grave and trying not to freak himself out that he refused to turn around for a good 10 minutes. When he finally did, there was a massive guy standing at the tombstone just staring down at my dad. He was wet from the waist down, and the bottom of his pants were torn off and covered in mud. My dad said he crawled out of the grave and ran like a bat out of hell. When he got to the road about a mile away, there were police cruisers with their floodlights on, driving slowly and clearly looking for someone. Apparently, the guy had escaped from an asylum in the town over and had waded in a few miles of swamps before walking into the cemetery. When I was 6, my parents' room was right beside me in my sister's room. I was a scaredy cat, always wanted to sleep beside my parents, although the one night that I didn't, something bizarre happened. Before my sister and I had went to sleep, we brushed our teeth, where my sister accidentally spilled water all over her pajamas. She changed into a new set, and we shortly went to bed. I woke up at 3 a.m., feeling extremely cold and confused. At the time, we lived in a country where it was hot throughout the year. We didn't have air conditioner at the time, so with limited ventilation, the room was usually extremely hot. Looking around, still feeling confused, I was able to hear my sister's deep breathing on the top of the bunk bed. Her breathing was in rhythm, and I didn't bother to check on her. I remember walking toward the door to move to my parents' room. Right outside our door is where our living room is located. A big gray couch is located in the center of the room, and there was my sister, wearing the wet pajamas, sitting on the floor in front of the couch. Her face was partly covered with her hair. Her hands were on her knees, where she was squatting while staring at me with a smile on her face. I vividly remember staring back at her and wondered, "Who's this girl? Is that my sister?" I was extremely scared and dumbfounded, remembering that my sister was fast asleep in the room. Although hard to deny, she looked exactly like my sister. I remember that she was really pale and had the same haircut as her. After a minute or two of staring, I remember running as quickly as possible to my parents, leaving the mysterious girl outside and a story to tell the next day. About 15 years ago, some Navy buddies and I decided to go ghost hunting. We had heard of this place where some strange shit would happen. It was a park near a beach and railroad tracks in Pensacola, Florida. We went there and found that it was a trail through some woods that would go toward the railroad tracks, then would come back to the main road about a quarter of a mile away. We went in and everything was dark but not too creepy. About a quarter through the trail, one of my buddies started freaking out about some dude following us. We all looked but saw nothing. We kept going. That's when he was knocked to the ground. He started struggling to get up. His eyes were bulging and he wasn't breathing. He was struggling and trying to get up but couldn't. He was even reaching for the wooden rails, but still couldn't pull himself up. He even ripped 2 fingernails out of his fingers trying. We tried to help him up but couldn't get him up. This was odd because he was the smallest one of us. It was like he was being held down. His lips were starting to turn blue and he was frantic. Then in the struggle, my other buddy's silver cross fell out of his shirt and then everything stopped. We hightailed it out of there and never went there again. We actually never went ghost hunting again either. When I was 7, a man tried to get me into his car. I was riding my bike around the neighborhood when this older car passed by, then slowed down and reversed toward me. The man started off by asking me some basic questions. He started asking me if my parents were home. He then opened his door and told me he had a present for me if I got in the car. My mother and grandmother had already given me the whole stranger danger speech and what to do, so I immediately started screaming for help. The man's expression changed instantly into a mask of hate, and he sped off as my neighbors started coming outside. A year or so later, a little girl a few blocks down went missing and was never found. Still gives me chills, 37 years later. My parents constantly try to explain to me how sick he is, that I'm lucky for having a brain where all the chemicals flow properly to their destinations, like undammed rivers. When I complain about how bored I am without a little brother to play with, they try to make me feel bad by pointing out that his boredom likely far surpasses mine, considering his confinement to a dark room in an institution. I always beg for them to give him one last chance. Of course they did, at first. Charlie has been back home several times, each in shorter duration than the last. Every time without fail, it all starts again. The neighborhood cats with gouged out eyes showing up in his toy chest. My dad's razors, found dropped on the baby slide in the park across the street. Mom's vitamins, replaced by bits of dishwasher tablets. My parents are hesitant now, using last chances sparingly. They say his disorder makes him charming, makes it easy for him to fake normalcy, and to trick the doctors who care for him into thinking he's ready for rehabilitation, that I will just have to put up with my boredom if it means staying safe from him. I hate it when Charlie has to go away. It makes me have to pretend to be good until he is back. I used to live in a small building downtown. One of the reasons I moved out was the bad neighborhood, including the guy in the apartment right over mine. He was a weird-looking guy who kind of kept himself. Around midnight, though, there was frequently a strange noise that got on my nerves. To be fair, it wasn't loud, but I'm a really light sleeper, so it was hard to keep my eyes shut with those little bumping sounds going on and on. It reminded me of high heels walking around, but not as loud, as if the person causing the noise was actually trying to be quiet. After a few days, I realized the pattern was always the same, like a recording played over and over with random intervals in between, and that went on for the better part of a year. Always the same sequence of bumps, slowly tattooed into my mind. Sometimes for hours straight during the night. It was only several years later, helping my daughter with her homework, that I learned a little bit of Morse code. She knocked on the table with her knuckles, and a shiver immediately went through my spine as I recognized that exact pattern. When I asked her what it meant, she said, "It's the easiest one, Daddy. It's the one to call for help." "Please, I'm literally begging you," I say, but the executioner only sighs and gives me a truly sorrowful look as he slides the IV into my arm. The chaplain sits beside me. Once he pushes the button, the drugs will be administered in a quick succession. Unconsciousness will occur in roughly 30 seconds, and death soon after that, he explains, even though I have heard it so many times before already. "Any final words?" Just, again, I beg you not to do this, I say. The chaplain nods sadly, sorrowful that I do not face my executioner with a clean conscience. That's the thing, though. I haven't murdered anyone. It's been this way my entire life. I don't know why, but whenever I would accidentally hurt myself, others around me would receive the wound. I once got a paper cut in class, and it caused 3 people around me to bleed from their fingers. In high school, I was in a car accident, and even though my side of the car was hit, my girlfriend developed a broken leg. I was always very careful. I took care of myself, trying to stay in the very best of health. But when I was mugged by that trio and he shot me in the face, their faces exploded, not mine. And when the cops came, they found me kneeling beside their bodies, trying to figure out what to do, and stupidly holding their gun. Around 30 seconds after the execution started, I see both the executioner and chaplain fall to the floor with a hard thump. I begged you, I repeated sadly. Julia knew she was smart. She was one of those clever children, the kind of child who figures out early on that parents aren't all powerful and all-knowing. The first time she realized this was when she got scared. There had been a noise in her room coming from under her bed or from the closet, and Julia ran down the hall crying,
Mommy! Daddy!
What's wrong, honey?
I heard a monster.
Julia glubbed. She expected them to comfort her or roll their eyes or get annoyed. Instead, they jumped up immediately and raced to her bedroom, where they checked under the bed, inspected the closet, and tested the window lock. They poked, prodded, and scoured every inch. Julia caught on quickly. She knew what they were doing. By taking her fears seriously, they were showing their little girl that she was safe and loved. They had probably read about it in some book. But the lesson Julia learned was that she had power. Thereafter, waking her parents became a nightly event. Julia would scream and cry. They would rush to her bedroom, and Julia would hide her grin behind tears. But not once did they ever complain. One night she could stand it no longer, and she burst out laughing when Daddy fell down while examining the light fixture, as if a monster could fit up there. What's so funny? He asked, rubbing his backside.
You?
Julia smirked.
You always believe me.
Daddy wasn't angry. He just looked at Mommy. Once, he said quietly, just once, we didn't believe your brother. And Julia, an only child, did not sleep well that night. We bought an old house, my boyfriend and I. He's in charge of the new construction, converting the kitchen into the master bedroom, for instance, while I'm on wallpaper duty. The previous owner wallpapered every wall and ceiling. Removing it is brutal, but oddly satisfying. The best feeling is getting a long peel, similar to when your skin is peeling from a sunburn. I don't know about you, but I kind of make a game of peeling, on the hunt for the longest piece before it rips. Under a corner section of paper in every room is a person's name and a date. After a while, curiosity got the best of me one night when I Googled one of the person's names and discovered the person was actually a missing person. The missing date, matching the date under the wallpaper. The next day, I made a list of all the names and dates. Sure enough, each name was for a missing person with dates to match. We notified the police, who sent out a crime scene team. I overheard one text say, "Yep, it's human." Human? What's human? Ma'am, where's the material you moved from the walls already? This isn't wallpaper you were removing. He had been given the watch on his 10th birthday. It was an ordinary gray plastic wristwatch, in every respect except for the fact that it was counting down. "This is all of the time you have left in the world, son. Use it wisely." And he did. As the watch ticked away, the boy, now a man, lived life to the fullest. He climbed mountains and swam oceans. He talked and laughed and lived and loved. The man was never afraid, for he knew exactly how much time he had left. Eventually, the watch began its final countdown. The old man stood looking over everything he had done, everything he had built. 5. He shook hands with his old business partner, the man who had long been his friend and confidant. 4. His dog came and licked his hand, earning a pat on the head for its companionship. 3. He hugged his son, knowing that he had been a good father. 2. He kissed his wife on the forehead one last time. 1. The old man smiled and closed his eyes. Then, nothing happened. The watch beeped once and turned off. The man stood standing there very much alive. You would think that in that moment, he would have been overjoyed. Instead, for the first time in his life, the man was scared. I had just started dating this girl I'd had a massive crush on. We were fresh out of high school, and her parents went out of town for the weekend. I was finally going to sleep in her bed with her. I was amped. I have a bit of trouble sleeping in a new place, so I was awake after she'd already knocked out. I tried to keep my eyes closed and let sleep come. Just as I started to drift off, I heard a noise that sounded like scratching on wood, quick and getting faster. I opened my eyes and oriented myself again. It wasn't scratching. It was whispering, and it was getting louder. My girlfriend was rapidly whispering, "She is the devil in disguise, she is the devil in disguise." I turned my head to look at her, and her eyes were wide open, looking directly at me, but glossed over, like she was looking through me. The whispering continued until she stopped mid-sentence. "She is the devil in disguise, she is the devil. He can't help you." She closed her eyes and went and rolled over, leaving me with a wary, what the fuck feeling. I asked her about it in the morning, and she said she used to talk in her sleep a lot as a kid. My ex-wife admitted to me, while we were still together, that she occasionally saw ghosts. She always has. She told me about several times when she saw them, but the one that stands out in my memory the most was when she went to a symphony concert with her mother. Shortly before they were about to start playing, a boy walked onto the stage, went right up to the conductor's stand, and knocked the score off onto the floor. The conductor looked confused, picked it up, put it back on his stand. The boy turned around and walked back off the stage. No one else saw the boy. including her mother who was looking the whole time. She also told me about when she went to see a psychic with a friend just for fun when she was in high school. Shortly after they sat down with her, the woman looked right at her and said out of nowhere, "You can see them, can't you?" She said it freaked her out, but she claimed not to know what the psychic was talking about. When I was a kid, I lived in Florida in a home that had no AC in the middle of summer. I woke up randomly around 3 a.m., freezing cold. Confused, I sat up in bed. My room was situated to where if I sat up and looked straight ahead, the entrance was right in front of me, which led to a little hall with a window on it. The door for the entrance about as tall as my next sister. I repeated the same actions, thinking my mind must be playing tricks on me. Called her name, and the figure did the same thing, coming back out as big as my eldest sister. At this point, I was kind of getting scared and repeated the process. Except the next time it came back as tall as my dad. I called out to him, and the next thing I know, it comes back, and now is as tall as the door itself. Except this time it wouldn't hide behind the door anymore. It just continued to stare at me for what seemed like forever. The room kept getting colder and colder, and eventually I just passed out sitting up. A long time ago, I was sleeping in my room and left my speakers on. They were old-time speakers, but they were big, so I ran a wire to my TV for playing my Xbox 360 on. I never used them for my radio, mainly because the antenna was broke and wouldn't get anything. I usually turn them off when I'm done, but that night I left them on. They didn't make any noise if my TV was off. In the middle of the night, I was awoke to a sound and I sat up. It took me a moment for me to realize what it was. In a faint but constant voice coming from both my speakers was, "Help! Help! Help me! Help! Help me! Help me! Help!" Over and over, repeating the words help. I instantly jumped out of bed and turned off the speakers. Being old school tube speakers, it slowly faded out, then stopped. As I stood there, heart pounding, like what the fuck just happened. I never left them on when I slept again. I don't believe in ghosts, but there was something that awoke me in the middle of the night when my family and I were in our cabin in the mountains, far, far from civilization. I didn't see anything, but I woke up with a start. Couldn't move. Held my breath out of fear. Sleep paralysis, right? Suddenly, I heard my mother from the adjacent room whisper my name. "Lisa! Lisa!" As if trying to get my attention. I was too paralyzed to reply. I eventually fell asleep. The following morning, my mother said she saw me sleepwalking. My sister said she too awoke with a start, and she'd also seen someone in our bedroom. I don't sleepwalk. I'd been in my bed the entire time. I once heard someone scream for help from outside and running footsteps. Looked outside, saw no one. It was freaky as hell. Another time I was home alone in my room, with nothing on and not listening to anything, when I suddenly heard a whistle inside my room that sounded like Ring Around the Rosie. It didn't sound breathy or anything. I looked everywhere, but found nothing that would have made that sound. I was terrified all day until my family got home around 4 p.m. This had happened in the morning. My friend's grandmother was out of town and asked us to check on her dog. She had a friendly German shepherd, jumping with excitement at the door when you showed up kind of dog. We went over, and to our surprise, found no dog waiting at the door. A little weird, but we thought nothing of it and went inside to find him. Got into the house and heard nothing. We start calling for the dog, Jake, and are answered with footsteps running down the stairs. We call out, assuming some other family member was there, but get no response. Now we start to freak out a little. We call his mom, and she assures us that no one is home and we're being ridiculous. More footsteps, but this time running up the stairs. I suggest the police. The house is being robbed, but my friend convinces me that we should check it out to be sure. So we make our way to the stairs and hear a bell chime. Buddy tells me the dog occasionally wears a bell, so it's probably Jake. We get to the door which leads to the stairs and see there's a small bell around the handle. My friend is terrified, and so am I. But we're trying to play it cool, so I lead us up the stairs. At the top, we see Jake the dog laying in a chair, shaking and obviously terrified. We couldn't get him to move no matter what we did. He just kept staring down the stairs. We searched the entire house and found nothing and no one. It's the only time in my life I've been genuinely afraid I was dealing with something paranormal. Friend's grandmother assures us to this day it was her husband, and that she still hears him walking around and talking from time to time. And I lived in a house with a bunch of my friends. We always said the house was haunted. We all just had so many eerie experiences. We all agreed one spirit was one of a young playful girl, and the other was of an angry old man. There was a shed in the backyard that had locks on the inside. We always imagined what bad things had happened in there. One day, me and a friend are sitting outside on the porch steps, both of us quiet. Everyone else is downstairs. I hear a very old sounding from behind my shoulder, where the wall of the house is. I didn't want to say anything. I didn't want to seem crazy. But out of my peripheral vision, I see my friend glance over his shoulder. So I say, "You heard that too?" And he says, "You mean an old man going heh heh heh?" I concurred, and we both noped down to the basement where everyone still was. The most terrifying paranormal experience I ever had happened in my grandma's guest room. I was young. I remember staying in that room, and every time I would wake up in the middle of the night to the sensation of someone or something running their fingers up my spine. I would be fully awake, but too petrified to move. This happened every single time I stayed in that room. When I was in middle school, my parents ended up moving into my grandma's house, and guess what? My sister and I had to share that room. I thought things would be different, but every so often, I would wake up and experience that sensation again. At one point, I even shot up and looked around the room, only to find nothing in sight. I'd lay down again and try to sleep, but there it was again. The feeling of someone running their fingers up and down my spine. It got to the point where I was just laying in bed trying to sleep, and it would just happen. You'd think that something like this wouldn't be scary. But there was just something about that feeling that made me feel terrified. As if I were getting touched inappropriately by a stranger. There was nothing I could really do to make it stop. All I could do was lay there and wait until it was over. I'm happy to say that I don't experience that anymore in the room. And I worked at a movie theater for a few years in high school. Throughout my time there, I was always told of the ghost named Fred who haunted Screen 5. There were always weird things happening in that theater. The screen randomly flickering despite changing the projectors. It was colder in there than anywhere else, stuff like that. The doors to the building would randomly open and close sometimes too. The story behind Fred was that he was an old custodian who worked cleaning the theater overnight. He was very religious and kept a rosary with him. He died of a heart attack, and somehow his rosary ended up hanging next to projector 5. A few years later, the theater was remodeled, and one of the managers took the rosary as a joke. On his way home, he crashed, his car rolling down a ditch, leaving him with moderate injuries. The next day, the rosary was back hanging by the projector, with no one knowing how it got there. When I was 8, I was with my mom, visiting one of her friends. I was playing with toys while her and her friend were talking, when a rubber ball, the kind you used in gym class for dodgeball, comes rolling down the stairs, stopping right on the bottom stair. All three of us stop and look at it for a moment. That's when my smart-ass mother says, "Okay, but can you throw it?" The ball proceeds to go flying across the room and breaks a window. So yeah, we got the fuck out of that house very fast. As a young teenager, I had a really scary nightmare in the middle of the night. In the dream, I was sitting on my parents' bed and looking in their mirror. In the mirror, I saw a woman sitting behind me with dead-looking eyes and long, black stringy hair covering her face. In the dream, I turned around and no one was there. When I turned back around to the mirror, she was even closer. This was probably around 1999 or so, and at that point, I hadn't seen a lot of scary movies that used that effect, so it scared the absolute shit out of me. I woke up from the nightmare, and my bed started shaking violently. I had a daybed with a metal frame, and it felt like a fully grown adult was standing at the end of the bed, shaking it back and forth with all of their might. This went on for several minutes, and I was paralyzed with fear. I couldn't even make a noise. Then it suddenly stopped, and I couldn't make myself move for a few minutes after that. I finally managed to jump out of bed and run to my parents' room and wake them up to tell them what had just happened. They told me I was dreaming, and they didn't believe me. It was and still is so very clearly and solidly real to me, and I have no idea what it was. My 2-year-old was really sick and throwing up about every half hour one night, so I stayed up with her so I could keep an eye on her. We were sitting on the couch in the family room around 11 p.m. I was watching TV, and she had dozed off in my lap. I thought about getting up to close the blinds and the glass double doors. They lead into the backyard, but I didn't want to disturb my daughter. I was kind of staring off lost in my own thoughts, when I realized I was actually staring at something odd. It looked like a face was peering back at me through the glass door. My heart started to race as I snapped to attention and realized to my horror that there was a face staring back at me. It looked like a man's face, but because it was so dark out, it was hard to make out any features. The face didn't move, but it looked like he or it had a small, creepy smile. The eyes also looked slightly red. Not glowing red, but swollen. I didn't see a body, just a face. Also, it was kind of low, as if he were crouched down. I didn't know what to do. I was frozen with fear. I glanced to the TV and pretended to be watching it as I thought of a plan. As I briefly glanced back at the face, it was gone. This scared me even more than if it had still been there. Eventually, I began to relax. I convinced myself that it was just some sort of illusion brought on by exhaustion and the way the lights in the room reflected against the glass. About 15 minutes later, I glanced at the glass doors again and saw something that made my blood run cold. Something was hanging off the side of the door. It was on the outside of the door, and it looked like some huge, shadowy man-monkey thing hanging there by an arm and gently swinging to and fro, like a kid would swing on stall doors in a public bathroom. But what really scared me was the weird smile and the red swollen eyes on the thing's head. And I didn't care if this was an illusion. I was done. I bundled up my daughter in my arms and ran from the house. I went over to my neighbor's and her husband offered to check around my house. He said he didn't find anything when he returned, something I figured would happen. I never saw anything like that again, but I did hear weird noises in my bedroom that night. We own a house that used to be a funeral home decades ago. My wife lives there full time, but due to my job, I'm not there as much. So I was lying in bed, and I remember being awoken by a turn signal colored amber light in my eyes. That didn't make sense, and I rolled over onto my back. It was then that a face appeared through the door to the bedroom, in the same amber hue as the light that woke me. Best I could describe was a tiki mask. I grabbed my wife's arm really hard and she yelped. The face turned the slightest bit toward her, then back through the door. She asked why I woke her. After I explained, she said, "Yeah, just tell it to leave you alone and it stops." Apparently, it's a fairly common occurrence. As a kid, we played in the basement a lot. The floor was open and cement, so we could roller skate around. Also, the walls were either dirt or bricks, so we were allowed to shoot BB guns at targets. Basically, I wasn't scared of the basement at all as a kid. One day, my sister was in a side room that had jars of peaches and pickles. Dirt cellar type room. Stayed cold even in the summer. She wouldn't let me in, and I was sure she was eating peaches. I could see her feet under the crack of the door, so I stuck my fingers under, and she messed around with my fingers and giggled. I felt that her fingers were wet, and I said, "Don't eat all the peaches, I want some." Then she pushed down on my fingers so hard. It hurt, and she was grunting and freaking out. I started screaming and tugging. Finally, I pulled my hand back, and she was quiet for a moment, before she hauled off and kicked the door really hard. I ran upstairs to tell on her, and there she was with my mom in the kitchen. It was pretty fucking freaky, and no one believed me. In fact, my mom just said my imagination had gotten away from me, and to forget all about it. It started out with relatively harmless things, like voices and footsteps, but it got progressively worse. There were several friends that came over who heard or saw things they couldn't explain. I had 2 friends who absolutely refused to set foot in my house again after seeing something that terrified them. Although I lived in that house for 2 years, it wasn't until the last year that things got really bad. One night I was sleeping in my bedroom, which of course was in the basement. I woke up to whispers that were a lot louder than I'd ever heard before. Then my bed started moving. It wasn't shaking like you see in a horror movie, but instead, it was moving as if something big was underneath it and crawling around. I could feel whatever it was pushing up against the mattress. I was honestly so scared that I couldn't even open my mouth to make a noise. It seemed like time was dragging on forever, and my head was pounding from being shocked. Realistically, it was probably only 30 seconds, until I took a flying leap out of my bed and bolted up the stairs into my mom's room on the top floor. The next day, she helped me drag my mattress up 2 flights of stairs to the room of her floor. I was 15, and I was so terrified of that house that I slept on her floor until the lease was up and we moved. As we were moving, our landlord was telling us how he was having trouble finding more tenants because people were too superstitious to live in the neighborhood. What nobody had ever mentioned to us was that the neighborhood was built in a relocated cemetery, except that there were still a few headstones and bodies forgotten in the far end of the neighborhood. The last I checked, the house was still on the market as the owner had claimed bankruptcy, and nobody ever wanted the house. To be honest, I have so many stories from living there, it still makes me worry at night. I'm still terrified of the dark to this day. At 18 years old, I sleep with the lights on every night. Some things in the world just can't be explained. When I was growing up, my friend told me a story that once when he was studying with his window open, it was about 8 p.m., he heard a faint scream in the distance that sounded like,
She's dead.
coming from the woods near his house. Turns out next morning at school, they told us a teenage girl had hanged herself in the woods, and that her friends had found her body last night while searching for her, and that scream was her friend. My grandfather used to go for long walks in the woods. One day, he got lost in the maze of trails and wound up on one he wasn't familiar with. As he was walking along, he found a shed and a man working inside. The two of them chatted for a bit, and he asked the way back to the main trail and was on his way. Every so often from then on, he'd make it a point to go visit his friend at his shed. They'd chat for a bit, but never for too long. He learned that the man's wife had passed away, and that he was the single father of a teenage girl. One morning, as he was heading out, he saw smoke above the tree line. Deciding to see what was going on, he walked that way until he realized it was the man's shed. He looked inside and saw two figures there, the man and a young girl. He ran home and called 911. He didn't find out until later that the man was suspected of murdering his wife after she found out he'd been sexually abusing their daughter. The man had murdered his daughter and committed suicide, and the fire was started in the struggle. I was about 6, staying at my grandpa's house while my parents went away for work. It was about 11 p.m. I was asleep but woke up to pee and wanted a snack. Went to the kitchen, opened the fridge, turned around, and see a man walking with a limp and a gun. It's dark outside, but there's an orange porch light casting a scary glow over the man. We were out in the woods. No neighbors. The man sees me and limps toward me. I run and tell my grandpa. He calls the police, grabs his gun, and yells at the man to leave or he'd shoot. The man didn't understand, and my grandpa gave him one more warning, then shot him. However, the man had been shot before my grandpa shot him, and that's why he was limping. Apparently, he robbed a local store and killed the owner. I don't recall all of the details, but hearing the news was horrifying. A murderer was on my front lawn with a gun in his hand. I have no idea what would have happened if I didn't wake my grandpa, or if I didn't wake up and get a snack. The timing was perfect. Years ago when I was a kid, I was staying at my aunt's house with my cousin. They lived just off a fairly busy road, so when cars passed by at night, the lights would sweep through the room. I remember one night in particular, it was wild out and I couldn't sleep. I felt immensely scared. A car drove by, and I saw a man's silhouette against the curtains, as if he were facing the window. I was petrified. I brushed it off as my imagination, but I was so sure. I remember being rooted to the bed and staring at the curtains all night. My friend and I would stay over at each other's house since we attended the same school and would take turns driving to get there. One of the nights I stayed at her place, we were getting ready to sleep. Lights were off, windows still boarded up from the hurricane that had hit. We were just talking, nothing special, when I looked over and saw a black mass gliding from her bedroom door past us and into the closet. The moment it came into view, I was filled with this deep sense that made my eyes water. I whispered to my friend to ask her if she had seen it too, and she said she had. Needless to say, sleep did not come easily that night. Another more recent time, a friend and I were walking down a pier late at night. We got about halfway down when we noticed a tall figure standing very still all the way at the end and facing us dressed in black. We both stopped at the exact same time and got the same wrong feeling, so we turned around and quickly went the opposite direction. Even after we got into the car and drove away, there was still that instinct of something being very wrong. While standing in my bedroom, I saw a shadow person walk from my closet through the bedroom and into the bathroom in the middle of the afternoon. It's happened several times. Also, one time I had a coffee cup thrown at my head. When I was 12, me, my cousin, and brother were building a snow igloo in my grandma's backyard. We had the whole dome complete, and were working on the inside making the walls smooth, when I accidentally smoothed it a little too much, and a little hole to the outside formed. Instantly, a hand shot through the hole and started reaching around trying to grab something. At first, none of us in the igloo really freaked out, since we thought it was my little sister trying to break our fort. After grasping around for about 10 seconds, the hand pulled itself back out of the hole. When we went to scold my sister, There was no one out there. There were no footsteps, apart from our own. When I was in high school, my mom was out of town for some reason. My younger brother and 2 sisters were staying with my grandparents. I was home alone. Monday morning, I'm up waiting for my grandpa to pick me up and take me to school. I'm sitting downstairs in the living room watching TV, when all of a sudden, I hear a man and woman talking upstairs. Sounds like they're in my mother's room. I turn off the TV to hear better. I could distinctly hear a man and woman talking to each other. I couldn't hear individual words, just mumbling. I got up off the couch and started walking toward the stairs. As I'm walking across the room, I hear a small child speak. Again, no individual words, but the sound of muffled voices talking. Pretty freaked out. The voices are definitely happening. As I approach the bottom stairs, something upstairs in my mom's room hits the floor, like a thud, as if someone pulled out a dresser drawer too far out, and it came out and hit the floor. The voices stopped immediately. I ran the fuck outside and waited for my grandpa. Middle of winter, no coat, did not care. I used to live in a cabin with a half-mile driveway that bordered a forest. I was by myself one night and had gone to bed. About 3 a.m. I opened my eyes for no reason. Laid there listening and thought it must have been nothing. Got up to go to the bathroom. Didn't turn on any lights. Full moon made the house bright enough. As I walked past a window, I see a guy standing in my driveway. He's just standing there milling around. I knew it wasn't a ghost, but I've never felt so vulnerable in my life. What if he tried to come into the house? I'm all alone, no weapons, far away from my neighbors. He eventually left, but I locked that place down like Fort Knox after that. When I was 22, I had my first apartment, and my boyfriend, now husband, would stay the night. I had a roommate on the other side of the apartment, and we each had a pet. She had a little yappy dog, and I had a very spooked cat. My boyfriend and I were smashed up in my twin bed, and I remember hearing the sound of my door opening. But when I looked up, it appeared closed. I went back to this half state of sleep and thought I was dreaming of a man looking down at us. In my dream, the man turns and walks back out of my room, but steps on my cat's tail, making her scream. I sat up. The door was shut. Everything was as it should be, but my cat was in my lap, poofed and shaking. My boyfriend woke up, and I was unable to really explain how a dream hurt my cat. I walked across the hall to use the restroom and wash my face. It was sometime around 4:30 a.m. As I was walking back to my room, I saw a man's silhouette against the window and covered myself and screamed loudly. The silhouette jumped behind the couch, and I ran into my room and locked the door, hysterically screaming that there was a man in our apartment. My boyfriend pulls on his pants and his shirt and leaps into action. He runs out and confronts the guy, and I start to call the police. My roommate stumbles out of her bedroom and groggily tells me to stop. She had been at a bar across the road and saw a homeless guy on her drunk walk home, and thought it would be a good idea to let him sleep on our couch. She didn't know his name. We never got his name, but for whatever reason, he let himself into my bedroom, stood over my bed, and stared at me while I was sleeping. We made him leave, and my roommate cried and said we were mean. My best friend and I worked at a cemetery as groundskeepers as juniors and seniors in high school. It was easy money, $5 an hour in the late 70s, mostly for edging, trimming, and keeping the graves tidy. We tore around that place in a souped-up golf cart with our tools and back. It was annoying to work in the rain, and it rained often, but it was truly a gravy job. No pun. There were a lot of dead flowers to remove, along with numerous empty liquor bottles and used condoms. There was a widow who left scribbled notes torn from a reporter's notebook upon her husband's grave, all completely illegible. On the graves of children, a lot of sodden stuffed animals that were sometimes mysteriously muddy. The creepiest thing I saw was a plastic drink cup and a wet baby doll, nails stuck in its head and burnt, as if someone went over it lightly with a blowtorch. I kept the head and hung it from my rearview mirror like a graduation tassel. But the worst thing I saw was the naked corpse of a young woman my age, a student at a neighboring high school, left neatly with her arms at her sides one foggy Saturday morning. She had been strangled right there, and her killer also punched her in the face several times before she was dead. Though she was identified quickly, her clothes were never found, and her murder never solved. My friend and I got grilled by the police over several sessions, but we didn't know anything. My friend quit a couple weeks later, but I hung on until I turned 18 when I was eligible to work in my uncle's printing plant. I'll never forget the bruises and her open, dead, blue eyes. A relative of mine who worked in a cemetery told me this story. The cemetery, a few hundred years old, and the church next to it existed before the 16th century. Considering the fact it is a remote place as well, most people back in the day were buried with wooden crosses and such. As time goes on, crosses rot away, new people get buried, etc. Nowadays, due to less people living in the countryside, that cemetery is pretty much growing over. A sad sight for such a pretty place. Anyway, someone was taking care of their relative's grave and decided to expand the area around the grave. This person removed the grass and tidied up the place with a rake. When they raked up white hair from the ground, they freaked out and left, leaving my relative, the cemetery attendant, to find this hair coming out of the ground. She reported it to the church and supposedly they reburied the body. Not even sure how there could have been a body so close to the surface. For years in my hometown, there's been a fetus in a jar left at a gravesite. Or so we've been told. It's been there since I was a kid. I should also say that if it is a fetus, it no longer looks like one. We've been told for years it is one, so the townspeople don't touch it. Mine is super short, but once I saw a live chicken shackled to a headstone. Everyone thought it was something to do with a curse or a sacrifice, but no explanation was ever offered up. I worked at a cemetery one summer as a groundskeeper. One thing I saw that seemed strange at first was an open flipped cell phone. Upon closer inspection of the tombstone, I realized it belonged to the deceased, who was in her late teens or early 20s when she passed away. A very sad reminder to me that even though I was around her age when she passed, I'm not invincible. Sometimes people forget that, especially when they're younger. I've never worked at a cemetery, but I once tagged along with a friend who did a while back. He and I were walking around the whole site when we spotted something pink and feathery hanging off of one of the statues situated above a grave. As we walk over, we see it's a pair of fuzzy pink handcuffs with matching panties, just dangling off a statue. We both had a good laugh, but still never knew why someone chose to display those items on a loved one's public grave. We figured it was just their way of showing their respect, or someone was having raunchy cemetery sex in the dead of night. My best friend's father works as a groundskeeper for a cemetery. He told us once that he saw a little kid leave a blanket on someone's grave, presumably his father's. The mother and the child were alone. He heard the child say, "He might be cold." I'm not a cemetery worker, but I once found candles and glass beads in a circle around my father's and a couple of other people's graves. I had no idea if they stood for some sort of ritual, but I quickly disposed of them. I worked as a groundskeeper over the spring and summer for my father-in-law, a gravedigger his entire life. Most of it usually just balloons and fake flowers. I hate fake flowers. I saw toys, unopened bottles, spare change, packs of unopened MTG cards, cigarettes, etc. One person even had a golf ball and a golf tee hid under 3 inches of weeds that I hit with my weed eater. That was nice. On the grave of a cat lady, who was buried with one of her cats, there was a food dish left by her family, who would fill it for weeks after. Wildlife is already a big problem in cemeteries, and now someone was feeding them. I worked at a neighboring cemetery helping my grandfather cut the grass. Went for walks there because it was close to my house. During one stroll, I stumbled across someone who was murdered and dumped into the bushes. I have no idea whatever came of it. I was honestly too traumatized to find out. I worked at a Jewish cemetery during university, so it was common for people to leave things on graves. By far the weirdest was after someone came and ate McDonald's at a grave, they left a breakfast sandwich on the gravestone. I guess maybe in a way, McDonald's brings everyone together. Golden Arches pun. I was active in paranormal investigations and ghost hunting. Did a lot of walkthroughs of cemeteries. One gravesite in particular had a bunch of trinkets on it, a handful of those glass beads people use in decorating, and a whole bunch of small toys that resembled a Happy Meal prize. I remember there being some sort of Wizard of Oz toy in there too, figure of Mulan, a few others. There was also a small ring of stones, no marker, nothing, with a couple of tennis balls inside it. I later learned that in the past, it was tradition that the first body to be buried in the ground, dedicated as a cemetery, be a dog or some other animal to keep guard, while human souls transcended to their destination. My family and I used to volunteer at a cemetery, helping take care of the graves, edging the stones and whatnot. A recently buried man had owned a hobby shop, and his family put a train set around his tombstone. Each train compartment held a little token or something he liked. There was a handheld poker game, a scratch-off ticket, a beer can, a deck of cards, and some other random trinkets. I thought it was a nice gesture, and it was kind of funny watching the train going in circles with all of these little pieces in the graveyard. One of our company's maintenance contracts was an old cemetery. Though I only went there a couple of times, one aspect of it did stick out to me. A plain granite brick, out of line with any other headstone or footstone. It had fallen out of a wheelbarrow while a retaining wall was being built, and no one touched it. For decades, everyone passed this brick by, thinking it went with a grave, and so it slowly buried itself into the earth. I sure as hell wasn't moving it. Now, though this isn't at a cemetery, Gregory Pacheco's monument on Palomar Mountain outside San Diego has several unopened beer cans, numerous keys, house and car, unopened junk mail, Hot Wheels, sunglasses, flatware, a handicapped parking pass, also not the descendants, a miniature sewing machine, pliers, a set of andirons, and a trove of other miscellaneous objects. While doing mission work in Juarez about a decade ago, driving the organization's truck from the supply depot to the construction site. On the highway, a van pulls on the on-ramp, speeds up ahead of me, and opens the back doors. Out came tumbling a half-dozen bodies, all with no hands, some without heads, others with extremely disfigured and destroyed faces. I accidentally ran over two of them. I got back to the worksite in a state of shock, and our site coordinator was asking how blood got on the front bumper. It took me a minute to formulate an answer. We cleaned it up before any of the extremely sheltered Midwestern teen volunteers or parents could see. The site coordinator gave me a bottle of water and sat me down in the shade. He went to the corner market, came back with a six-pack, and drank with me until I got my bearings back. I watched a man kill himself outside of my apartment. He was a middle-aged military veteran who lived on the floor below me. My friend and I were up late studying, taking a break on the balcony, and we watched him go out to the parking lot, put a gun to his head, and pull the trigger. Is the only person I've ever seen die. He had anger issues and was always yelling at his wife. Didn't realize it was that bad. It really fucked with my head and led me to questioning my own stability. When I was about 8, I got invited over to a friend's house. First, I enjoyed it, but after some time it got pretty weird. When we went down to the cellar, his mother showed up, high and half naked, and got us some cookies. Completely stunned, I denied her offer and continued following my friend to the cellar. Down there, we played Beyblades until his brother, who was 6, showed up. He wanted to play with us, so my friend had this idea to handcuff his brother and treat him like a sex slave. He put his penis in his mouth and started pissing in it and all over his face. After some minutes of watching this and being terrified, I told him I had to leave because my mother said I should show up early at home. I was in such an uncomfortable situation that I had to think of it the whole day and never told anyone. I used to work at a McDonald's restaurant above a main train station. I was pretending to work one shift, but actually just staring out the window down onto the train platform. That's when I saw someone take a running leap in front of a train. They carried them off the track in pieces wrapped inside white sheets. I was paralyzed and couldn't move to stop looking, though I wished I would have. I saw someone get stabbed once. I was quite young, but had a mother who was pretty nonchalant about me watching violent films. So I grew up on lots of Arnold, Stallone, Van Damme films, and I thought I knew what someone being stabbed would look like. Nope. The knife didn't just slide in. It had a moment of give, and then, in my memory at least, there was a kind of pop sound. I read somewhere how your brain will insert a noise where there is none. I can't recall the scientific term at the time, but I assume that's what it was. It was the amount of blood. No slow trickle, just whoosh. Blood was everywhere in seconds. They didn't sort of stagger back. There was no Shakespearean soliloquy. They just looked down, and as they did, their legs buckled out, and they hit the ground. I remember screaming from both parties, and then I was dragged inside. When I was 17, I was placed on some medication for a severe head injury. This medication made me extremely suicidal, so my doctor decided to place me in the psych ward. They didn't have any room in the pediatric ward, so they put me in the adult ward. I walked into my room, which I was to share with another person, and there she was, a 60-year-old woman, naked, matted pubic hair, legs in the air, furiously masturbating and singing Daniel by Elton John. I later found out that she was schizophrenic and a prostitute, and that the cops had picked her up trying to fuck a statue. They moved my room later that day because I was freaked the hell out. On that same visit, a dude tackled me while I was coming out of the bathroom in my bathrobe and slippers and tried to lick my feet. While on a road trip with friends, stopped at a random highway exit rest stop plaza in the middle of nowhere in Pennsylvania. We get a table at a Wendy's. At an adjacent table, there's an elderly couple. Both of them are over 80, sitting on one side of the table, facing two female mannequin sex dolls posed like they were joining them in the meal. We were high as fuck, and after we left, we came up with all sorts of wild theories as to what was going on. Maybe they lost their daughters. Maybe it was for security, to make it look like they were accompanied by younger people. Maybe they were at a mannequin sex doll convention. Fuck if I know. About a year ago, I walked into a public restroom to wash my hands, and there was a woman facing the mirror, brushing her hair, telling herself that she was pretty. I was too scared to tell her that she was in the men's restroom and ran away as fast as I could. I had to take a shit while on a road trip with my wife. We start arguing when she asks if I can hold it. We pull over at a shady-looking rest stop and I rush for the bathroom. I pull open the door and there stand 3 men. Guy number 1 is jerking off in the corner. Guy number 2 is fucking guy number 3 in the ass. We are all now staring at each other for what felt like forever, when guy number 1 says, "It's all right, man. Come on in." I ran back to my car, told my wife to drive, and I ended up shitting on the side of the road a mile or 2 away. I witnessed a horrific accident in Big Sur. Bits of motorcyclists smeared and chunked all down the road, mixed in with motorcycle bits for about 100 meters. Head in the helmet, with some spine visible out of the mangled torso, Apparently, his front wheel clipped an oncoming fender, and he basically flipped straight over into the asphalt at about 45 miles per hour. Essentially, he was slammed into the pavement and exploded. Someone was puking on the shoulder. My friends and I had blankets in the car. We covered him up and waited for the cops to show up. About 2 years ago, me, a buddy, and our girlfriends decided to make a spur-of-the-moment trip down to the coast of Texas. We arrived about 2 a.m. at this run-down motel that was right on the beach. As we're climbing the stairs, we hear a motorcycle flying down the highway toward the overpass just in front of the motel. Just as my buddy was saying, "Man, that guy's hauling ass," we hear a loud crash. Both of us knew he had cracked. We immediately drop the cooler and tear off to the overpass in search of this guy. This is where it gets really disturbing to me. Buddy decides to run toward the other side of the overpass to stop the cars. As he is doing so, these two dudes run up to where I'm at and ask what happened, so I tell them. As I'm telling one, the other reaches into the dude's pocket that is splattered and wrapped around the fucking light pole and takes his wallet, looks at me and says, "Fuck it, I say. He don't need it anymore." I stood in disbelief until the other dude announced that the cops were on their way, and they hauled ass out of there. I used to work at a restaurant in the same building as a super shady dive bar located right across from the city's main park. Now it's one of those first nice days of spring, so naturally there were a lot of people in the park. We were dead slow and taking turns going to the bar to hang out on the porch. So me and one of the bar folks are chatting, and I noticed this picnic table, partially blocked by the park wall, with a couple of park dudes hanging around it. One of the guys is sitting at the table, making these hideous grimaces. When he traded places with another guy, I figured out what was going on. There was a woman under the table giving them head. I go next door to tell my coworkers, and for about the next half hour, we watch this spectacle from the bar porch. It's pretty much surrounded by kids playing, people hanging out on blankets, throwing frisbees, and not one person noticed what was going on. Finally, one of the cooler park bums, we'll call him Dirty Feet Cheese Bill, because that's what we called him, strolls up to bum a cigarette from one of the picnic table guys, sees this tableau, does the about face, nope, walks over to us. "Man, the guy on the table eating her out. That shit's nasty." He bums a smoke and leans on the wall watching for a minute, stench blinding us, smoking his cigarette. "Ain't nobody say nothing? That's something else." Well, somebody must have eventually noticed because the cops descended on them and broke up the party.